thanks for joining us for today's Tools and Technology Seminar Series. As always, there is an online audience, so if you're online and you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A pod. As you think of them, they come up and we will pass them up to our speaker. Of course, if you're in the room and you have questions, just raise your hand as normal. We encourage you to ask them during the presentation. You don't have to hold them on till the end. And if you do ask questions, if you can try to speak up a little bit, that'll help the online audience hear the question in addition to the answer. I think that's actually all I have to say right now. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker. Today we have Anna Kay, who's an MD PhD student in computer science and engineering in Stella Yu's lab.
Okay, thank you. So today I wanted to give a brief talk about feature learning. This is mainly just about the research in general, and if there's 2 minutes left, I'll talk about my research at the end. So just as a structure of what's going to happen, first is introduction of the problem, why we care about feature learning, what makes a good feature. Then we'll talk about what makes feature learning hard and specifically focus on model bias and one strategy to deal with it. Then I'll do a brief aside on visual explainability. So how do we understand what a network is paying attention to? And finally, talk about some self-supervised training. So representation learning, how are we going to get features when we don't really have a lot of annotations? So in general, here is a model. You take some input X, it goes through the model and outputs some output Y. Inside the model, there's many representations you can pick. Just any intermediate form of the data can be counted as a representation. But oftentimes we're focusing on the very last representations kind of in the end here. So why do we want representations? Well, oftentimes we want the models that give representations to be reusable. And so we can adjust them for new data types, fine tune them, et cetera. So this is really foundation models. We hope that they develop good representations of data. Some properties of representations that you might hear about that could be useful to maintain is invariance. So invariance just happens after you have some input and it changed in some way, but the actual model feature or representation hasn't changed. And that's because you hope that it recognizes these two cats, for example, that are symmetric as the same thing. So maybe you don't want the feature to change. Or you want it to change, but in a predictable way. So if you predictably slid the cat to the side, you want equivariance. So you want the feature to predictably change and like shift along the axis. So again, reminder, we just want good models that are good feature extractors, and we want them to be adaptable to new tasks or unseen inputs. Here's just some examples of foundation models that exist in biology that all focus and use feature learning in some way. So we have AlphaFold transformer-based, but now in version 3, I believe they added diffusion. We also have ESM2 and ESM-fold transformer-based. And then there's this new model called BioClip, which concatenates or which associates images of different species with their class or with their taxonomy tree. So now let's talk about model bias. So model bias is what makes feature learning hard. And because it happens because models aren't perfect. So if you give a model an input with data points that are kind of skewed, so you have some classes or some types of data that are more prevalent than others, well, then the model is most likely going to neglect everything in this tail and really just focus on representing well the more frequent data points. So we, however, believe that performance on rare classes is as important as performance on frequent classes. And so we want to have a technique that improves performance on rare classes without significantly hurting performance on frequent classes. Just as an example of bias, let's look at CLIP. So CLIP is a model that has learned to associate, just by scraping off the internet, a bunch of images and text. It has learned to associate an image with a text. And if we want to use CLIP to predict something new about a new data set, like have it act as a classifier, we can do as follows. So this is an example from ImageNet 1000 or ImageNet 1K. That's a data set that has a number of images for 1000 different classes. It's balanced, so different classes have the same number of images. And so what we do is we have the name of the class. We have the name of the class here. We create it into a sentence, a photo of a blank. We pass it through the text and we have some representation or some feature for the text. We also have the similar thing for image, and we pass the image through a network that creates an embedding or a feature for the image. And then we look at the similarity between the text and the image, and whichever similarity is bigger, that's the class that we want to assign this image to. But if we try this on ImageNet, and remember we have the same number of images per class, we actually see that the number of predictions that we get per class is really variable. So Some classes, we barely predict any images existing in them at all. In other classes, we have like thousands of them. So there's this really big model bias. And why does this happen? Well, because the training data for CLIP just hasn't learned some niche words, or it's not as used to associate some niche class words with images. It's more likely going to associate some other words with those images. And then you can see how the precision and the recall also track with this. So what do we do about, how do we solve model bias? So there's some techniques such as data balancing, which can happen just you resample your less frequent classes. You can augment them when you resample. So either maybe changing the color or changing them slightly or kind of shifting away in a small radius. You could also do augmentations in the feature space. So take a representation in the middle of the model and then sample from representations that are similar to it as your new data points. You can also synthesize some data if you want. You can use ensemble models, and that's where you have models that are dedicated to, for example, solving problems and understanding what's happening at the tail, versus models that are dedicated to understanding what's happening in other places. Then you have a voting between these models. You can also have early exit, and that's more of a strategy to have more of the model useful for rare classes or for hard cases. So this happens when in the middle of the model, you decide, oh, I'm already pretty confident about the class of this particular image or about what I want to do with this particular input. And so I'm going to stop processing it. And then the later part of the model is where harder inputs will go. And then finally, you can directly increase the contribution of less frequent data to your loss. So if you make a mistake on something in the class that you know is infrequent, you want to penalize that mistake more. And hopefully the model learns that it should really try hard to predict those classes. Another strategy is logit alignment. So logit alignment kind of straddles some of these categories. But the logit alignment is based in the theory that you really want to create a Bayes optimal classifier. So logit alignment is just for classifiers in the way that's presented here. And the goal is to have the lowest average per class error, where the average per class error, each of the classes have been equally weighted in this average. And you can show mathematically just with a simple integration, you can check out these people here that showed it, that if you really want to get a Bayes optimal classifier and you already know the conditional probability, so you know that the model is going to predict y given this image, you can create a p-balance just by dividing by the prior probability that you have assigned to this class. And if instead of using the conditional probability to assign your prediction, you use this p-balance to assign your prediction, well, then you will be getting a Bayes optimal classifier. So this is now how it's going to be used in a model. So usually in classifier models, at the end, we have something called logits. So we have a vector or just a list of integers or numbers that is the same length as the number of classes we predict. And afterwards, these numbers go through a softmax, which is an exponential form function that's going to transform them into other numbers that all sum up to 1. And hopefully these represent probabilities in some way. So what we do is if we want to apply this p-balance, we want to transform these logits into something that is balanced. And we can do that just by simply subtracting the log. The division becomes a subtraction. And so this is useful after the model has been trained. We already have the unbalanced logits, and we want to convert them into something balanced for prediction. However, we could also have the model learn balanced logits itself. And that's by rearranging the formula. So you want the loss to see the imbalanced logits. So just have the logits, whatever logits the model outputs, add log p to it. And then the model or the loss will see the imbalanced logits, while the model will be developing balanced logits. So why does this work? I guess why are we able to get this? That's because the loss, cross entropy loss is Bayes consistent. And again, maybe not because there's a caveat here that I'll get to in a minute. But so cross entropy loss is the traditional loss that we use to train classifier groups. That we use to train classifier models. It looks like this. And it has been shown that an optimal minimizer, so a function that minimizes the cross entropy loss, so a model that minimizes the cross entropy loss, is nearly the optimal minimizer of the loss of like a classifier. So you can minimize this and you're actually minimizing the or you're maximizing the accuracy. However, in reality, we have a restricted set of functions. So this all works. So this transformation here only works if you're confident that your logits are actually the kind of inverse of the conditional probabilities. But if you're not getting the conditional probabilities, then all bets are off. You don't really know why subtracting p will help you. And because models are a restricted set of functions, you never get to this condition of a nearly optimal minimizer of CE. And in fact, if you look at testing and you have a model that was trained with cross entropy and you now look at it during testing, it's most likely going to be overconfident. And that's because, well, during training, it's going to learn to predict it's going to learn the training data well. So it's going to try to be very confident in the predictions and the logits that it's going to make. However, the model now has constrained itself and it's really only able to predict very high or very low values for the logits. So you shift to testing, it may not be confident or making mistakes, but it's very confident in the mistakes that it makes just because of its structure. And so if you consider like this happening, then you try logit alignment during versus after testing. Logit alignment during training performs better than during testing. And this is also just to say that elements that are important for differentiating rare classes can still help you understand common classes. And that's why it's possible to improve accuracy on less frequent classes without significantly hurting at all the more frequent classes. All right, section 2, visual explainability. So I'll talk about convolutional and transformer models specifically in vision because I work in a computer vision lab. However, these techniques can be applied to other models. They're just, maybe people don't really care to visualize where we're looking at in the image that much or in a text block. So what's going on here? So imagine we have a convolutional network. We start with an image, it passes through a series of convolutions. At the end, it gets some feature maps. So in a convolutional network, the image is transformed into a number of different smaller like images or squares or matrices, you can say. These feature maps get flattened out and they pass through a number of fully connected layers until we get to these logits and then softmax, etc. Imagine now we have a class and we know that we like care about, for example, the class of the cat here. We're gonna go here. We can calculate the gradient and back propagate and figure out how important all of the points on these feature maps are for the final class. Then we can average them. So take just the general average for each of the feature maps of the gradient and use that as a scaling factor to say how important the elements of that feature map are for the prediction. So we just multiply this in, and then we cut off whatever negative values we have in the feature maps because we really want to care only about the positive prediction or which classes which elements of the matrices positively contribute to predicting the class. We don't care about something that decreases the probability of tiger cat. So another thing to say here is that kind of this seems a little bit average, like random, right? Like we back propagated here. Why did we take global average pooling? Why didn't we just multiply element wise in the importance of all of these pixels? That's because mathematically there's a way that you can show that assuming the constraints that you're only able to multiply one thing in, multiplying the global average is the most important thing. There's another thing called GradCam++ that's going to make an improvement shortly. So GradCam is great, but it's not very good at localizing objects. Why? Because, well, we have just this one thing that's being multiplied to the average of the importance being multiplied to the entire feature map. So there's a small part of, so there's a feature map focused on just the tail, for example. The part of the object in that feature map is really small. So overall, the feature map might not contribute a lot to the class, but we really still want to get the tail that was part of that feature map. And it does contribute to the object. So in GradCam, yeah, so if a particular feature is small in the map or like a particular element of the image is small in the map, that map has low weight, but the object area is still important. So we do want to weight things separately. So this is what happens in a GradCam++. They say that we're going to weight, so the W is the weight that we're going to be assigning to every point on the feature map. If we give it the weight is going to be dependent on the particular pixel. And you can get what this dependence should be instead of just naively multiplying this derivative by saying that you want the optimal, so you want whatever the weight is multiplied by the feature map to recover for you your class. And so if you solve this equation, you can figure out what your Aij is supposed to be. And so GradCam was a similar thing, except for you had WK happening before or after the summation happened. So this is the difference in explainability between GradCam and GradCam++. So you can see how smaller features like the neck here and the legs here, which may have existed in separate feature maps from the main body of the animal, are still visualized. Okay. So next part is visual explainability of transformers. Now, unlike GradCam, so GradCam had some theory motivations and they kind of showed that whatever they were visualizing was going to reflect the true class. Transformers has a theory backing the transformer visualization that I'm going to talk about, has a theory backing. However, they also have made just some decisions about how they're going to propagate, gradient, etc. Because otherwise it's too complicated. So review of transformer structure, if you haven't seen this before, and I'm giving this in the context of images, but again, you could just have words and every word it's like has some embedding to it. So what happens in an image is we create little patches in the image. And so each of these patches is transformed into a patch embedding. And then the patch embedding passes through a series of attention and fully connected layers or feed-forward networks. And feed-forward networks are just fully connected MLPs. So what happens in the attention network? That's the most important part. So you have a part of the image. That part of the image has become a vector in a patch embedding. That vector is now going to be transformed into three new vectors, the Q, K, and V, and together all of the patch embeddings form the QKV matrices. Then ultimately the transformer is a matrix product in series, first between the Q and the K, the queries and the key matrices, and then it's a matrix product between the result of this softmax divided by a normalization scaling factor, and then multiplied by the V, the value matrix. And so this is going to give you the output. So if you have multiple transformer heads, so sometimes people say that a transformer has multiple heads. So each of these attention feed-forward network blocks is a layer. Within each attention, we can repeat this process multiple times. So we have multiple different Qs and multiple different Ks and Vs. And we then concatenate the results in some way that is multi-head attention. So we've attended to ourselves multiple times. So how do we do visual explainability of transformers? So the visual explainability of transformers focuses on the attention map. So the product of the Qs, Q and K, we kind of ignore the values here. So if we have an output, we can calculate the gradient of, just like how we did in GradCam, we calculate the gradient with respect to the output for the attention maps. And so now that we have the attention maps, we have the gradient, we can say, oh, maybe this is how important a particular patch is for the output. But that's not exactly the case, because as we move along the transformer, the tokens or the small like little boxes in the attention map, they all start representing things that are far away from the initial positions they were assigned to. So before you could confidently say that, oh, this little box in the attention map, that represents this part of the image. But now, after you've moved some layers down, that box can now represent a combination of elements from all different areas in the image, because it's been multiplied, matrix multiplied multiple times. But you can unravel this, and that's just simply by doing another matrix multiplication of the attention matrices, you can get back structurally to have every little box in this output represent a particular position on the starting image. So, but you don't want to just matrix multiply naively, because what if at some point the gradient is 0 by accident? You don't want to just zero out your entire result. So what you're going to do is you're going to add the identity matrix here. And this is, again, this is like a choice that the authors made in this paper. So if you add the identity matrix, then even if the gradient at some point is 0, well, it's okay, because the product is still going to just ignore that attention map and continue on as normal. And there's also this relevance term that gets multiplied into each attention map, and that says how important that attention map is for the final output, and in fact, how important every element of that attention map is for the final output. That's a little bit like the scaling that happened in GradCam. So here you can see the results of their visual explainability model for transformers. So here's just on single class images. You can see it highlighting the fish here. And then on multi-class images, you can see it more clearly highlights different regions of the cat, and you have a little bit more of a gradient here, or a little bit more specificity in terms of what is being highlighted. So now moving on to the last and largest section of self-supervised training. So imagine that we have a bunch of unannotated data, and we want to create a model that's good at getting representations from data that we can then fine-tune for a downstream task. So how can we do this? So I'll talk about two approaches. The first approach is we're just going to take all of the data that we have. We're for each data point going to cut out a small chunk of it. And then we're going to ask the model to predict what was cut out. And hopefully in that way, it's going to learn to fill in the blanks of the data and learn what structures exist in the data. Another approach is to say we have a lot of different elements in our data, and we want to just have a model be able to understand identity. So understand that this data point is itself, it's not similar to all of the other data points. So we're going to try to spread out the different elements. So this is okay. So this is the first approach where we're going to cut out some parts of the data and try to have the model fill it in. How does it work? So this was built for transformers, and the reason for that is because we're going to be removing like 80% of the data. So we're just going to cover up and remove 80% of the patches that we generate for an image. We take whatever's left of the patches, we're going to pass them through an encoder, which is just our big transformer network. And then we're going to place back all of the empty patches that we kind of ignored in the transformer. And we're going to have a smaller decoder, but it's not too small. It's not like one layer. It does have a few transformer layers in it. And we're going to ask the model to fill in the blanks here and predict the image filled in. So the reason that we do this in transformers and that this doesn't work as well if you try it in convolutional networks is because convolutional networks, you can't just ignore that you masked out some patches. If you put an image that has a bunch of zeros in it in convolution, those zeros are actually going to just mess up and like interact with all of the neighbors. Versus in a transformer, you assign every patch a position embedding. And so in that case, the transformer doesn't really care how many patches you give it. You can just give it a list of all the patches you have, and the other patches you just don't feed into the transformer. So how did they choose to remove 80% of the image? Like, that seems kind of hard. Like, visually, I don't think that I would be able to reconstruct this animal here. But it turns out that they just did a lot of experiments, and they figured out that 80 was pretty important to have. So these are their two experiments, and this is basically depending on what they're going to be using the downstream model for. So the first is they're just going to then keep only the encoder. So the decoder gets thrown away after all of this is happening. We only care about getting good features from the image. So they're going to keep the encoder, and then they're going to fine tune the encoder, maybe add some linear layer or whatever, fine tune that encoder for classification. And here they see that depending on the masking ratio they use, how good fine tuning, how did fine tuning finally allow us to get the final output? And so we got really good accuracy if we pre-trained with a higher masking ratio. Linear probing is very similar. We're again throwing out the decoder, leaving just the encoder. But instead of allowing the model to then update the entire model and try to get the correct class, we're just going to update the very final layer of the model. We're going to add like a single linear layer at the end and only change it. The rest of the model is frozen. And so this kind of, you can see that it also cares more about having a higher masking ratio. And it doesn't rescue itself as much as over here, because here you have the ability to change the entire model structure. So perhaps during the supervised training part, it's able to rescue and kind of fill in, like learn more things, versus here the model base is really fixed. So what it learned from self-supervised. And so here you can see the actual real results of what the fill in the blanks looks like, and it looks pretty good. So a little bit blurry, but generally really good. So the other strategy. So the other strategy is contrastive learning. So this is where we have different images, image X1, image X2, or data X1, data X2. They're going to produce some features Z1, Z2. And we want features from one image to be similar to each other, and features from different images or different elements, inputs, to be different from each other. So how do we do this? There's two methods here that I'll talk about, well, maybe three. So the first one is SimClear, and this is a little bit like the generic based model method that you would think to do. So you start with your input image here. You're going to augment it, and that's saying that you're going to change it in some way that's improving, or that's not improving, changing it in some way that still keeps the identity of the image, still trying to have invariance between whatever happened in the transformation. So you want these representations to be invariant of that transformation. And so some transformations that these authors chose was to crop and resize, flip the dog, add some noise, add some color, etc. So we've transformed the image in two different ways. Now we have two slightly different versions of the image, but we ask the model that it predicts them to be the same. So we have the model here. We're going to get the representation out of the model. And then we're going to add a little bit like a small network, just a 3-layer MLP, one hidden layer, because we might not want to use the very final representation that we're trying to make identical. We might want to use something a little bit earlier, because there may be actually a small difference between this dog and this dog, and we don't necessarily want to just use the very final output. So we're going to get the representations here, but we're going to maximize the agreement a little bit further down in the network between these ZIs and ZJs. So how do we maximize agreement? So if we want two vectors, so we have an image, we had it like X, we had the transformed image XI, the transformed image XJ. We also had a batch of images. So usually when we're training a network, we take a lot of images together and we try to optimize the network based on how the average result for all of these images. So let's say we have a batch size of n images, and each image was augmented and doubled up in this way with two different transformations. Well, then you can say that you want the similarity between the vector or between the representations of one of the images or the image in two different transformations to be similar. And you want it to be different from you want the similarity between the image and all of the other possible images or basically all of the other elements in the batch, even if they're from the same class, they're just different images. So you want these representations to be different. And so you're going to put them in the denominator of your loss. So this is the sim-clear loss function. And so you have the positive example up top, you have the negative examples down here. You're going to divide everything by temperature, and that's a scaling factor to say how much variability you want to keep in the distribution. So if temperature is really high, you're going to become more flat. And so you're going to see less of a difference between the you're gonna emphasize less the importance of being different between the numerator denominator. So once you have this loss function, you're going to try to optimize for it. And so the authors do that, and this is what they find. And they find that you need to have a really large batch size to be able to perform well. So batch size really only starts from 256. You can't go much lower than that. And the more you train, the better it is. So they train much longer than any traditional networks usually do. Usually you stop at like several hundred epochs. Here they went up to 1,000. They still kept seeing improvements kind of pretty close to the end. And larger batch sizes were important. So you needed a lot of examples in this denominator to get things to work. But what if you don't have a large batch size? So like 9,000, close to 9,000 images is pretty excessive. And nowadays, maybe you can do it if you have the GPU, but back then, this was a couple years ago, 2020, 2021, that was actually really hard to do. So if you have a limitation of your memory, you have a limitation on the batch size that you can give. And maybe you can give like small batches to different parts you can separate and do multi-GPU training, give pieces of batches of the batch to multiple GPU machines and then try to combine things, but also very hard. So let's say you have this limitation. So what can you do? Well, you can get more negative examples from the previous batches because you're going to assume that even if you have some randomness, your image that happened in one batch, it didn't happen before because it happened in this batch. But you can't just naively take the features that you got from previous batches and use them as negative examples because you already looked at the previous batch and updated the network based on that. So whatever features happened belong or were made with a network that is one step behind your network that you're now comparing to. So if you are worried about your batches coming from different images, then you can do what MoCo did. So MoCo is momentum contrast method, and they proposed that instead of having the images, like here, all of these images were processed in the same way and with the same model, we're going to have the image that we're comparing to be like the positive example image to be processed by one encoder or one model. And then all of the other images that are going to be our negative examples, they're going to be processed by something else, a different model called momentum encoder. It has the same structure as the encoder, but it updates its weights much slower. And so basically its weights at every step, you're going to get some loss. You're going to update the model weights. But while you're going to update the encoder weights normally, the momentum encoder weights are going to be updated by the new parameters of the encoder. So after the encoder was updated, times a very small constant plus its old weight. So it's really just it's moving along the gradient, but it's moving much slower than the encoder model. And that means that between batches, the momentum encoder hasn't changed that much. And so now it's actually okay to keep information from previous batches here and from the new batch here. And hopefully they're not that much different. And so now you use all of these images together as your negative examples, and you can store, and the next step, you're going to store these new negative examples from the preceding batch, and you're going to maybe kick off, because you have a queue, you have a limited number of elements that you're storing, you're going to kick off some of the older some of the older elements that you had, some of the older negative examples from the storage queue. So, okay, we have time, presumably. So then I'll mention the slide. I was thinking skipping it versus not skipping it. So, this is a thing that happens if you separate, this is a multiple GPU problem. So one of the contributions the authors notice is that if they just tried this method as it was, and they ran it, they actually found pretty poor performance with traditional batch normalization. And that happened because they had multiple GPU machines. So they were training the model. So what happens in multiple GPU training is you have a copy of the model on each of the GPUs you're training it on, and then you're going to update, you're going to run part of a batch on each GPU, and then you're going to update the, like sum up the results, and then do the gradient for all of these, sorry, get the gradient for all of these models and kind of average them afterwards, but you're processing each batch separately on each GPU. And when you process each batch separately, the batch normalization that happens inside the model is actually batch dependent. So on one GPU, the batch normalization could be one thing, on another GPU, the batch normalization could be something else. And it turned out that the authors were putting the images, both positive examples, on the same GPU always. And when they did that, the batch normalization, because it has some trainable parameters, batch normalization learned to just separate out the, or to help improve the image, make the image representations of the same image similar, and without actually making them truly better. And so what they did to solve this, the authors solved this by just shuffling where they put the positive examples, and then also having the batch that they used for the momentum encoder be different from the batch they used for the traditional encoder on every GPU. And that way the batch normalization couldn't necessarily learn to always help align the results of momentum encoder and encoder, because batches were different between this and this model on a particular GPU. And then an alternative solution that later, so that SimClear did and MoCo v3, because they would also face a similar problem had they been using that, is they just aggregated the batch norm parameters across all of the GPUs. And so this way, all of the GPUs were having the same batch norm. There was little learning to be had. So MoCo went through a series of updates. It went to MoCo v2, which just had a similar structure, just added some of the same augmentations that SimClear had, and essentially that was that. MoCo v3 is a paper by some different authors, and this was less about proposing MoCo v3, but more about studying how transformer training behaves. And so, but let's talk about the modifications they made to MoCo. So the first thing they did was they modified the loss a little bit. So instead of using the loss they had here, or similar to SimClear, they used an info MCE loss. And that's essentially the probability of predicting the match. So you have this part from the term from the numerator also exists in the denominator. And that's the only difference for info MCE loss. They also symmetrized the loss. And so they only used the loss of augmentation against the second type of augmentation. So they, okay, so what they did was they had one image, they took the image against one half of the negative examples and then took another transform of the image and looked at against the second half of the negative example. So they split the loss into two parts. And then they also, unlike MoCo, completely forgot about the queue. So they completely forgot about trying to minimize the amount of memory or the amount of samples we have in a particular batch. And that's just because technology had advanced by this point. But they still kept the slowly updating momentum encoder. So that gave a few percent performance improvements. But the most important thing that these authors noted was that instability when training with a large batch size. So if you have a transformer and you start training it with a very large batch size, you can see in this graph that at some point during training, its performance just completely tanks. And then it kind of recovers, and then it tanks again and recovers, tanks again. And ultimately, the final performance is not as good as training with a smaller batch. And the question is, why did this happen? So the authors tried to analyze this by looking at the gradient. And so how does the gradient change over training time? And they noticed that there was a spike, a large increase in the gradient that was backpropagated against. at the every moment that, like, a little bit before all of these descents or falls happened. And so what they hypothesized was that it just, when we have a large batch size, it can accidentally, in the earlier layers, there's an origination of this descent, or this, there's a big change, or a relatively big change in some of the earliest layers. And as this propagates to the later layers, this creates this dip in accuracy. And the solution they found, and they tested this out empirically and it helped, is that they simply froze the earlier layers of the model. And so this is a little bit like they just decrease the model size and they don't allow some of the initial transformations to ever change. And this improved accuracy, but what this really did was it forced the model to be like more narrow and constrained in what representations it can represent. So it wasn't able to jump to potentially new loss minimizing places. And so it was also more sensitive to initialization. So, wow, we have time. I'm kind of surprised, but so this is, I can talk briefly a little bit about my research. I only have 2 slides on this. So I have 2 projects that I'm working on. So the first project is asking the question of how do we represent data well? And so there were these theoretical results that showed that if you have a particular optimization criteria, so a new loss, then the features that you're going to learn are going to be most optimally with the lowest number of parameters able to represent your data. So if you truncate the features, you're going to get the best representation you can get of the data for a particular feature size. And so our goal is to adapt this model training method to reality. And in reality, of course, there's a challenge of how do we actually achieve and follow this optimization criterion effectively and reach its true minimum. And my second project is medically related. And in this case, we're trying to understand the patterns of age-related macular degeneration. So right now, people know about the disease general associations between, for example, if you have some lesions starting in one area, maybe they'll progress to a different area next. And we have this vague understanding of the disease process, but we don't know when the disease will progress to a new area. And we also don't really know for most of the disease features how they will evolve over time, and if there's any particular populations or patient groups that evolve differently. So our goal is to uncover that, but that's a very broad goal. So our sub aim is we're beginning by segmenting the pseudodrusen, which are a finding that exists in the eye. And you can see all of these little spikes here above this membrane here, the retinal pigment epithelium. And so we're trying to get a density mapping of all of these points, and you can see them here on the on-fast scan as well. And so if we get this density map of these points, then we're trying to, so we have already some close enough to density map at this point, but now we're looking at patients and trying to see if there's clusters and different populations of patients that behave in different ways and evolve in different ways. And so one of the benefits to our approach compared to previous approaches that we are combining the images from cross-sectional and on-fast imaging. We also have some better loss functions and model architectures that we're attempting. And that's all I have. So please ask questions.
Thank you for your great talk. And you introduced 2 types of self-supervised learning approaches. First one is masking, and the other one is contrastive learning. So when it comes to bringing about approach in specific research, do you have any suggestion of what to choose for specific research?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to achieve good, so let's say your data is not repetitive and you want to have the model really learn to understand like objects as they are. So for example, if it sees a part of a cat, it should infer that this is the rest of the cat. And you really care about getting the global understanding. In that case, I would recommend approach 1. So I would recommend approach MAE, because what the model has learned to do is has learned to look at a small piece and infer what the whole is. If you have data that's repetitive and maybe even like my project here in this project here, this one uses contrastive learning because the goal is less to be able to predict what a new position is, because I don't want to have any bias about where a new lesion will happen depending on if a lesion is here, I don't want to be biased that a lesion will happen over here necessarily, but I do want the model to distinguish between different images and say, oh, well, this image is not like its neighbor, which has lesions in a different pattern. So I think it just depends on what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you for talking, and I think this is two approaches. Do you have any idea to combine these two approaches? One is the master supervised learning, and the other one is the constructive learning. So do you have the idea to combine these two strategies?
I mean, I'm sure you could. I will say I haven't seen any papers that, granted, this is not necessarily my area, this is more like I've researched, I haven't seen any cutting edge research that combine them. But it is a little bit hard because it's a challenging, both of them are pretty challenging tasks. So, and they're doing different things. So you could ask the representations from this image to also be different from the representations of another image that's going through MIE. Like nobody is stopping you from adding a contrastive loss at any point in this process. And in fact, people have done like contrastive loss, not before SimClear, people did contrastive loss on patches of images. And so they try to contrast and say, this patch of the image is closer to this other patch of the image than it is to any patch in another image. And so that's been done, but it was less successful than I think either of these approaches. But theoretically, perhaps, and maybe depending on your application, because even like it really, like for example, AlphaFold and things like that, like they develop new transformer architectures and new approaches because they were dealing with a particular data format. And so it may be reasonable in some data format that you would want to do this, but yeah.
Okay.
Any other questions? Give it another minute. If anyone has a question online, you can type it into the Q&A box. Hearing or seeing anything, so let's take the other one.